Hi everyone, and welcome back to Fundamentals of Object Workshop. In this lesson, we'll learn how to create registered table objects in Ursa Studio. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, to get started, let's navigate to the plus sign icon, and we'll go ahead and select the Create New Data Object. Registered table objects makes tables and views that exist in your firm's database available to Ursa Studio. When the table is registered, it's then visible to the data model for use downstream. Now, registering objects does not create a new table. It only makes the data in the existing table or view available for downstream modeling or measure building purposes. This is a great way to leverage valuable assets in your existing database from day one of using Ursa Studio. We'll start at the top with the table name. Here, you enter the schema and name of the table that you'd like to register for your database. We'll use a table in this instance of Ursa Studio as an example. This next field is the object name field, and here you can enter the name of the object, and if desired, you can utilize the naming convention that we reviewed in the Import Object lesson. The object description field is where you'll enter a brief explanation about the table or view being registered. The Ursa Health Technical Services team uses this field for entering information about the table or the view's grain size. For example, our table contains one record per patient, so our object description should read one row per patient. Moving right along, the layer field is related to the layers we discussed in the Ursa Health data model lesson. So each of the layers in this dropdown are related to the layers we reviewed in that previous lesson. For our example, we will specify the source data layer for this particular object. The Manage Layers button opens the Metadata Manager's layer screen in a new tab in your browser. Here you'll see the standard Ursa Health data model layers, which are system defaults that cannot be edited. While you may never actually need to add a layer, you can if it becomes necessary. You can also edit any of the layers that you create. Changes made in this screen will be reflected in the Layer dropdown. If you need to access this screen from outside of the Object Workshop, you can go to Metadata Manager and select Layers from the User-Defined Fields subsection of the page. When you return to the Registered Table Object screen, you'll notice a refresh icon next to the Manager Layers button. This allows you to refresh the values in the dropdown if any changes were made. All right, let's take a look at the next field, is visible to layers, which allows the user to specify which data model layers the registered table object will be available to for development. For example, if the only data model layer listed in this field is the natural object layer, then this registered table object would only be visible to users who are creating objects at that layer of the data model. Each layer, by default, is available to specific layers that likely need to see objects at the layer you've specified. The net effect of specifying visibility is that when you're creating objects associated with various layers of the data model, you only need to see objects that you are likely to find useful at that layer of the model. By default, the Use Layer Default checkbox is going to be selected. As we've worked out the sensible layer visibility options for you, as a best practice, you can leave this box checked. Doing so just helps to ensure that the object is only available in the downstream layers that are most practical for utilizing it. Tabbing down to the Temporal Class field, an object's temporal class describes its relationship to time. So there are 3 temporal classes: entities, events, and intervals. Entities are objects with observations that do not represent a moment in time or a period of time. Instead, these objects, for analytical purposes, are considered to have a continuous presence. For example, an object capturing information about a patient would generally have an entity temporal class. Depending on which temporal class you select, you are prompted for additional date metadata. When you specify the temporal class to be entity, the case ID field changes to entity ID for you to specify the field or fields that uniquely identify the object. Moving on to events. So events are objects with observations that represent a single moment in time. For example, an object with 1 observation per outpatient office visit would be considered to have a temporal class of event. If an object's observations consider only a single date, then the object likely has an event temporal class. When we select event as the temporal class, a new field, event date time, appears, and the case ID field changes to event ID. In the event date time field, you can enter the date field used to identify the event. And in the event ID field, you can enter the field or fields that uniquely identify each record in the object. Now, I'd like to note that in instances where an object's record needs a date for unique identification, you do not need to enter the date. As an example, think of an object that contains data about office visits, but does not have a primary key. In order to uniquely identify records, the triplet of patient ID, provider ID, and visit date is needed. In this example, visit date would go in the event date time field, and patient ID and provider ID would go in the event ID field. Intervals are objects with observations representing a period of time with a start and end date. For example, an object capturing information about a home health episode of care where the start on any given day and end some days later would have an interval temporal class. When interval is selected, 2 new fields, interval start date time and interval end date time, both appear. The same concepts that apply to events also apply here. In the case of an interval, you specify the start and end dates, for example, admission and discharge dates. In the case ID field, you'd enter the column or columns that uniquely identify the record. In this case, the object contains a list of patients, so we will select the entity option. In the Entity ID field, we add the patient ID, and in the Patient ID field, we will again add the patient ID. All right, so now you see a list of columns associated with the table or view that's being registered. To the right of each column name is the default field label that will be used as the object moves downstream in the data model. You can overwrite the default label by entering one of your own, but at this stage in the data journey, we recommend very rarely altering field names and instead do that downstream. The Terms panel allows users to see any terms associated with the object or create new terms as desired. We'll review this functionality in much more detail in a future lesson, but in brief, this functionality allows you to define key concepts associated with columns, objects, and business or clinical definitions that are ultimately displayed to end users on reports. Since we've already reviewed the data review panel's functionality in a previous lesson, I won't spend too much time here, but I will note that unlike import objects that need to be created before you can utilize this feature, registered table objects will show you a review of the data that'll be associated with the object. All right, so now we are ready to save this object. So let's scroll back up to the top of the page to find the save icon in the upper right. All right, so we've landed back in Object Workshop, and we can see our newly created object at the top of the table here. So I'm going to click back into our newly created object. And once you've saved the registered table object, you'll have two additional icons to the right of the save icon. The data review screen, which you may be familiar with, can be used to interrogate the data, create boards, and share news about the object. And going back to our Object Workshop tab, you can also archive the object, which we'll do now. And that gets us to the end of this registered table objects lesson. So thank you for taking a moment to review this lesson with me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.